Enough! Get out! Richard Whitmore snapped, shoving his chair back so hard that its legs scraped sharply across the restaurant floor. He pointed straight toward the front door, his face rigid with anger. Did you hear me? Leave. Now. Do not stand there making excuses. I do not want to see you in my restaurant for one more second. Martha Carter stood beside his table, still holding the plate she had personally brought out from the kitchen. A streak of sauce had splattered across the cuff of her white chef's coat when Richard slammed his hand against the table. Throughout the elegant, crowded dining room, the clinking of silverware against china slowly faded into silence. I apologize that your meal took longer than expected, Mr. Whitmore, Martha said. Her voice remained calm, though her fingers tightened around the edge of the plate. The first steak was overcooked. I asked for a new one because I did not want to serve you a dish that failed to meet the restaurant standards. Richard let out a scornful laugh. The restaurant standards? He leaned toward her. This is my restaurant. I am the one who decides what the standards are. Sitting across from him, Eleanor Whitmore gently placed one hand beside her water glass. Richard, she said quietly, trying to calm her husband. It is only a meal. Let it go. Let it go? Richard turned sharply toward his wife, then back to Martha. I spent the entire morning trapped in a meeting that went nowhere. I came here for one peaceful lunch in a restaurant that bears my name, and instead I am left waiting for a simple meal as though my time means nothing. He looked Martha up and down. How long have you worked here? 10 years, sir. 10 years? Richard's voice grew harsher. You have worked here for 10 years and you still cannot get a plate of food to a table on time? Martha slowly set the plate down, handling it so carefully it was as though the slightest sound might make his anger erupt even further. The kitchen is short-staffed today, she said, but I am not offering that as an excuse. I simply did what I believed was right as a chef. You did what you believed was right? Richard emphasized each word. Do you think I built everything I have by letting employees decide when my time matters? He pointed down at the table. Look at me when I am speaking to you. Martha slowly raised her eyes. For most of her life, she had learned to swallow certain humiliations, dismissive looks, and moments of unfair treatment, not because she was weak, but because bills still came due every month. Rent did not pay itself, and she had a daughter who needed opportunities Martha had never been given. I am looking at you, Mr. Whitmore. Richard gave a cold nod, then listen carefully. Take off your chef's coat. You no longer work here. Near the kitchen entrance, Annie Carter stood frozen beside the service station, still holding a stack of neatly folded napkins. She had heard Richard's first angry words, but she had told herself her mother could handle it. Martha was the calmest person Annie had ever known. She could endure the pressure of a sweltering kitchen, long shifts, and difficult customers without ever losing her patience. But this time, Richard did not stop. You should be grateful that you were allowed to work at a restaurant like this for 10 years, he said, completely unaware that Annie was walking quickly toward him. Instead of standing there defending yourself, you should understand that you have just wasted my time. Sir, I never said I was doing you a favor, Martha replied. You did not have to say it. The way you are standing there says enough. Richard waved his hand dismissively. Employees make mistakes, then immediately start talking about how difficult their lives are because they expect sympathy. Richard, Eleanor said again, this time more clearly and firmly. That is enough. He ignored her. Go, Richard said to Martha. Right now. And tell someone to bring me a meal prepared by a chef who actually understands customer service. Mom. The sound of Annie's voice behind her made Martha turn quickly. Annie, go back to your station, she said at once. No. Annie stepped forward until she was standing beside her mother. Her heart was beating so hard that it hurt inside her chest. But her feet did not retreat. I cannot walk away while he is speaking to you like this. Richard glanced at the name tag on her apron. And who are you? I am Annie Carter, she answered. I am an intern here. And the woman you just humiliated in front of this entire restaurant is my mother. Richard curled his lip. Then your mother should have taught you that children do not interrupt adults in business matters. This stopped being a business matter the moment you started humiliating my mother in front of everyone. A wave of murmurs moved through the dining room. Several diners had turned fully in their seats to watch. A server near the bar stood motionless, still holding a tray against her chest. Richard's face darkened. He was not accustomed to being challenged in a boardroom, much less in one of his own restaurants by a young woman wearing an intern's apron. You should think very carefully before you say another word, he warned. Annie stepped forward, instinctively placing herself partly in front of Martha. My mother has spent 10 years making this place better than you have ever bothered to notice, she said, her voice trembling but never weakening. She comes in before sunrise. She stays whenever the kitchen is short-staffed. She remembers which elderly customers need less salt because of their heart conditions. She knows which widower orders the same dessert every Friday night because it was his late wife's favorite. Annie's eyes filled with tears. My mother did not serve your meal late because she was lazy or careless. She served it late because she refused to put bad food in front of you, even while you were humiliating her. Martha gently touched her daughter's elbow. Annie, sweetheart, please. Annie shook her head, tears now shining in her eyes. No, Mom, you do not deserve this. Richard pointed toward the door once again. Both of you can leave. I do not need an employee and her daughter turning my dining room into a public scene. You are the one who caused this scene, Annie said. You could have accepted my mother's apology. You could have spoken to her with the basic respect any human being deserves. Instead, you tried to make her feel small just because you had a bad morning. Richard clenched his jaw. You know nothing about my morning, and you know nothing about my mother's life. For a moment, Richard seemed stunned, as though her words had struck something inside him, but his arrogance quickly returned. I know she works for me. Annie's voice lowered, calmer now, but even more painful. My mother works in your restaurant. That does not give you the right to humiliate her. Martha drew in a deep breath. Near the bar, a diner quietly lifted a phone and began recording. Richard noticed, and his anger flared even higher. Where is the manager? He shouted. Call security right now. I want these two removed immediately. The floor manager had already moved near the edge of the dining area, but the moment he met Richard's eyes, he stopped. Two veteran servers exchanged helpless looks. No one dared step forward. At that moment, the last of Martha's composure broke. She stepped around Annie and clasped both hands in front of her white chef's coat. Please, Mr. Whitmore, Martha said, her voice beginning to shake. Please do not fire my daughter just because she stood up for her mother. I need this job. I have given everything I have to this restaurant for 10 years. I apologize that your meal was delayed. I will be more careful. I will make sure it never happens again. Annie stared at her mother, her chest tightening painfully. Mom, you do not have to beg him. But Martha did not look at her daughter. Please, sir, she continued. Let me finish my shift today. Let Annie continue her internship. She has done nothing wrong. Richard looked at her with cold contempt. Now you want forgiveness? After your daughter stood in the middle of my dining room and spoke to me like that? He shook his head. No, I have made my decision. Both of you will gather your things and leave before security has to escort you out. Annie's anger suddenly gave way to a cold, crushing fear. Her mother truly needed this job. Annie knew about the grocery bills Martha kept clipped to the refrigerator door. She knew about the payments on the old car her mother always stretched until the final day of each month. She knew how many nights Martha had stayed awake searching for internship opportunities for her daughter, because she believed a place like Whitmore's restaurant might open a door Annie would otherwise never have. Annie turned toward Eleanor. Her voice softened, almost pleading. Mrs. Whitmore, please, she said. I am sorry I raised my voice. I know I should not have argued like this in the dining room, but he is hurting my mother. She drew in a shaky breath. Please do not let him take my mother's job away. She needs this work. She has been here for 10 years. You can ask anyone in that kitchen what kind of person my mother is. Eleanor looked at Annie, then at Martha. The concern in her eyes deepened. Annie continued, her voice smaller now. You do not have to help me. I can leave, if that makes things easier. Just please let my mother stay. She did nothing wrong, except try to prepare a good meal for your husband. Martha immediately reached for her daughter's hand. No, sweetheart, she said, tears gathering in her eyes. You will not give up your opportunity for me. Richard turned his face away, his disgust obvious. Eleanor, do not encourage this any longer. They are leaving. But Eleanor did not answer him. She was staring at Martha, not at the white chef's coat, not at the hands trembling in front of her, but at her face, the warmth of her voice, and the way she instinctively held Annie's wrist as though checking that her daughter was all right. A distant memory began to sharpen in Eleanor's mind. Slowly, she rose from her chair. Mrs. Carter, Eleanor said, her voice dropping lower. "Have we met before?" Martha's expression changed. Annie felt her mother's hand tighten around hers. Richard sighed impatiently. "What difference does that make?" Eleanor turned sharply toward her husband. Her face had gone pale. "It makes an enormous difference," she said. The dining room became so quiet that the soft hum of the air conditioning overhead could be heard. "Richard, this is the woman from the parking lot." He frowned. "What parking lot?" "The night of your asthma attack." Eleanor's voice began to tremble. "The night you collapsed in the rain, unable to breathe, and nearly died before the ambulance arrived." Richard's hand, which had been resting on the table, suddenly went still. Eleanor stepped away from the table, her eyes never leaving Martha. "She was the one who knelt beside you. She was the one who found your inhaler in your coat pocket when you could no longer speak. She called the ambulance, kept you conscious, and rode with you to the hospital until the doctors took over." Richard looked at Martha as though he were truly seeing her for the first time. Annie turned toward her mother, her voice nearly failing her. "Mom, is that true?" Martha did not answer immediately. She only stood there in silence, still wearing the chef's coat Richard had ordered her to remove only minutes earlier. Tears filled Eleanor's eyes. "Do you remember, Richard?" she said. "When you woke up, the doctor told us that if that woman had not acted when she did, you might not have survived. I tried to find her so we could thank her, but she left the hospital before we ever learned her name." Richard slowly rose from his chair. The rage on his face was gone, replaced by horror and disbelief. Martha lowered her eyes. "I did not do it to be repaid, sir," she said quietly. "I simply saw someone who needed help." Her words seemed to rob Richard of the strength to remain standing. Only minutes earlier, he had used his power to humiliate her in front of a crowded room. He had called her a useless employee. He had fired her from the place where she had devoted 10 years of her life. He had forced her to beg for both her own job and her daughter's future. And all along, she was the woman who had once saved his life without asking for anything in return. Eleanor looked straight at her husband as tears ran down her cheeks. "Richard," she said through a breaking voice, "you just fired the woman who saved your life." Richard Whitmore looked at Martha as though the white chef's coat had concealed an entirely different person until this very moment. The fury that had consumed him for the past 10 minutes was suddenly gone, leaving his face stiff with shock and unease. "Was that you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Martha slowly released Annie's hand and instinctively smoothed the front of her apron. It was a small habit of hers whenever she felt uncomfortable under too many watchful eyes. "Your wife remembers correctly," she replied. Richard parted his lips to speak, but Eleanor spoke first. "I sat beside your hospital bed all night," she said, her eyes still fixed on Martha. "The emergency room nurse told me that a woman from a nearby restaurant had found you unconscious at the edge of the parking lot. By the time I arrived at the hospital, she had already left. The nurse said she returned to work because someone still had to cover the closing shift." Eleanor took a slow step toward Martha, her voice catching. "I tried to find you afterward." Martha gently shook her head, exhaustion visible on her face. "That was not necessary, ma'am." "Not necessary?" Eleanor said, tears beginning to rise in her eyes. "My husband might not have survived that night." Martha glanced at Richard. He was still standing motionless, one hand gripping the back of his chair as though it were the only thing keeping him from collapsing in the middle of the dining room. "He needed help," Martha said. "I helped him." That should have been the end of it. Annie could hardly believe what she was hearing. Her mother had saved the life of the man who owned this restaurant. Yet for more than a year, she had quietly returned to his kitchen every day, arriving on time, preparing every dish with the same care, never asking for a favor, a bonus, a promotion, or even a word of thanks. It was so completely like Martha that it made Annie's heart ache even more. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Annie asked, her voice thick with emotion. Martha turned to look at her daughter. "Because doing the right thing is not a story you tell to make yourself seem more important." Richard flinched slightly, as though those words had struck him directly. The manager who had been summoned finally approached, but stopped several steps away from the table, clearly unsure of what he was supposed to do now. "Mr. Whitmore," the manager said carefully, "would you like me to move the guests to another area, or ask everyone to leave the dining room for a moment?" Richard did not answer. His eyes remained fixed on Martha. Behind the kitchen doors, the order bell rang once. In the silence of the dining room, The sound seemed painfully loud. No one immediately responded. Annie recognized that bell. It belonged to her mother's work. The work Richard had tried to take away from her only minutes earlier. "My mother begged you to let her stay," Annie said, her voice shaking with anger. "She apologized to you even though she had nothing to apologize for, and you still kept shouting at her in front of everyone." "Annie," Martha said softly. "No, Mom." Annie turned toward her, tears threatening to spill over. "He needs to hear this." Richard looked at Annie, but the certainty and arrogance that had filled his face only minutes earlier were gone. Now he looked like a man being forced to see himself in a mirror he could no longer turn away from. Annie took a deep breath and continued, her voice quieter now, but clearer. "When you treated my mother that way, you had no idea she had once saved your life. But that should not matter." She looked directly at him. "My mother deserved respect even if she had never done a single thing for you. She should not have to save your life before she becomes worthy of being treated like a human being. If you believe every person deserves respect, no matter their job, please like this video, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment. Annie's words hurt because she knew they were true. Richard reached behind him and gripped the back of his chair. Not to pull it out and sit down, but to keep himself steady. "Mrs. Carter, he began, his voice dry and strained. "Not here," Martha said. Her voice was not loud, nor was it harsh. But those two words were enough to silence him. Martha stood straight, her hands clasped in front of her chef's coat. "There are guests waiting for their lunches," she said. "There are people in the kitchen trying to do their jobs. I do not want my private life discussed in front of a room full of strangers." The calmness and dignity in Martha's voice brought a lump to Annie's throat. Her mother did not need to raise her voice to reclaim her respect. She only had to stand there, surrounded by watching eyes, and refuse to let her pain turn her into someone else. Eleanor stepped closer. "Of course," she said quietly. "You are right." Richard swallowed hard, trying to recover his voice. "You have not been fired," he said quickly. "Neither of you has been fired." "What I said it in anger. I should not have." "Richard," Eleanor interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "Do not reduce this to a moment of anger and assume that taking back your words will make everything all right." Richard fell silent. He looked at Martha, then at Annie. There was nothing left for him to defend. Martha lifted the plate of steak from the table. The meal had long since gone cold. "I will have this remade," she said. "No," Richard said immediately, almost in panic. "Please, don't." Martha looked at him for a brief moment but did not ask what he meant. Perhaps she understood that, right now, Richard no longer had the right to ask her to do anything more for him. She turned and carried the plate back toward the kitchen. Annie immediately followed her mother through the swinging door. The moment they were out of sight of everyone in the dining room, Martha set the plate down on the stainless steel counter. Both her hands remained gripping its edge, as though letting go would release all the strength she had forced herself to hold on to until now. Her shoulders sagged slightly. "Mom," Annie said. "I'm fine." "No, you're not. I need to be." Martha reached for a clean cloth and began wiping the streak of sauce from her sleeve. "Table 6 is waiting for the chicken. Table 11 needs a different side dish, because Mr. Feldman cannot eat onions. Life does not stop just because someone decides to forget how to treat another person with kindness." Annie looked at her mother, aching for her and helpless all at once. "He fired you in front of everyone, and then he took it back, because he found out you saved his life." Annie's voice broke. "Not because he suddenly realized you were a human being who deserved respect." Martha's hand stopped wiping her sleeve. For a few seconds, the sounds of the kitchen continued all around them. Oil sizzling in pans, knives striking cutting boards, cooks calling out orders in short, familiar phrases. Then Martha turned to look at Annie. "That is a difficult truth to accept," she said softly, "and you are not wrong for seeing it." She set the cloth down. "But Annie, never let the ugliness in the way someone else treats you decide what kind of woman you will become." Annie quickly wiped away the tears sliding down her cheek, frustrated that she had finally started crying. "I couldn't just stand there and let him speak to you like that." "I know." Martha lifted one flour-dusted hand and gently wiped the tears from her daughter's face. "And no mother could wish for a braver daughter than you." She gave Annie a sad smile. "But courage is not only speaking up when someone is wrong. Sometimes courage also means staying calm enough to decide what needs to happen next. Annie lowered her head, struggling to steady her breathing. Before she could answer, the kitchen door slowly opened. Eleanor stood there alone. She had removed her coat, folded it neatly, and draped it over one arm. Her expression was gentle, but her eyes still carried unease and regret. "Mrs. Carter," Eleanor said, "may I speak with you privately after your shift ends?" Martha glanced at the row of order tickets clipped above the counter. "My shift ends at 4. I will wait." "You do not have to do that." Eleanor gently shook her head. "Yes," she said, "I do." Martha studied Eleanor for several seconds. At last, she gave a small nod and turned back toward the kitchen. Annie stood still as she watched Eleanor walk out of the kitchen area. Through the round window in the swinging door, she could see Richard still standing beside the untouched dining table. The chair he had shoved back remained crooked from its original position. His meal had been taken away, but he did not sit down. He simply stood there alone, in the middle of the restaurant that bore his name. As though for the first time he understood that power might force people into silence, but it could never erase the truth about the man he had just become. At 4 o'clock, Martha untied her apron and folded it the way she folded everything, carefully, as though a piece of cloth deserved not to carry the weight of a difficult day. Annie had finished wiping the service station twice, though it had been clean the first time. She kept looking through the kitchen window, expecting Richard to leave or to send someone else with another command. He had not left. He sat at the same table with a cup of coffee untouched in front of him. Eleanor sat across from him, her hands folded around her own cup. Neither of them spoke. The lunch crowd had thinned, and the remaining guests had learned to keep their voices low. "You don't have to stay with me," Martha said, slipping her arms into her old brown coat. Annie took her bag from the shelf. "I'm not going anywhere." Martha studied her daughter, then nodded. "All right." When they stepped into the dining room, Eleanor rose at once. Richard stood more slowly. For the first time that day, he looked unsure whether he was welcome to move closer. "Mrs. Carter," Eleanor said, "thank you for speaking with us." Martha kept her purse over one shoulder. "I agreed to speak with you, Mrs. Whitmore. I didn't agree to make what happened easier." Eleanor accepted that without argument. "You shouldn't." Richard lowered his eyes. "May we sit?" Martha glanced at Annie. Annie wanted to say no. She wanted to take her mother home, make tea, turn the lock, and leave Richard Whitmore alone with the memory of his own voice. But Martha gave a small nod and chose a table near the front window, far from the private table where the trouble had begun. They sat. Annie remained close enough that her knee touched her mother's beneath the table. Richard tried to begin twice before words finally came. "My wife told me what she remembers. I'm afraid I don't remember much at all." Martha looked out at the Chicago sidewalk, where late afternoon traffic moved under a gray sky. People do not usually remember the worst moment of their own sickness clearly. "What happened that night?" Annie asked. Her voice was softer now. "Mama, you never told me any of this." Martha took a breath. "It was last March," she said. "Cold rain, the kind that gets inside your shoes before you reach the bus stop." That evening, she had closed the kitchen after a charity dinner in one of the private rooms. Most of the staff had gone home. Martha stayed behind because a young dishwasher had cut his palm on a broken glass, and she did not want him finishing the cleaning alone. By the time she left through the side entrance, rain was hitting the pavement hard enough to blur the streetlights. She had pulled up her hood and started toward the employee parking lot when she heard something strike the ground near the row of executive spaces. At first, she thought someone had dropped a briefcase. Then she saw a man on one knee beside a black sedan, one hand gripping the car door, the other pressed against his chest. His breath came in short, dry sounds that frightened her before she reached him. "I asked if he could hear me," Martha said, looking at Richard. "You tried to answer, but you couldn't get enough air." Richard's hand moved unconsciously toward his chest. "You had an inhaler in your hand," she continued. "You dropped it under the car." "I remember the pavement," he said quietly. "I remember thinking I had to reach something." Martha nodded. "I got down on my knees and found it. Your fingers were shaking so badly I had to help you hold it. I called 911 and told you to stay with me." The restaurant around them seemed to recede for Annie. She could see it now. Her mother in the rain, coat soaked through, kneeling beside a stranger, while everyone else had already gone home. You went with him to the hospital? Annie asked. The paramedics asked whether I was family. I said no. They said I could follow, but you were barely conscious. Martha paused. I didn't want you waking up alone. Richard looked down at the table. Eleanor reached for his hand, but he did not seem to notice. When I got to the emergency room, she said, a nurse told me a restaurant employee had come in with him. I saw you down the hallway, but a doctor was speaking to me, and when I turned around, you were gone. I had a shift the next morning, Martha said simply. Annie stared at her. You went back to work? What else would I do? Mama, the owner of the restaurant almost died in your arms. He was not the owner to me that night. He was a man on wet pavement who could not breathe. Richard shut his eyes. I should have found you, he said. Yes, Eleanor answered before Martha could. You should have. Richard looked at his wife, wounded by the plainness of it. Eleanor did not soften. I asked your office to identify the woman who helped you. They said they would handle it. A week later, you were traveling again, and you told me to stop worrying. You sent money to the hospital foundation and decided that meant the matter had been settled. I didn't know it was her. That is not the point, Annie said. Richard turned to her. You keep saying you didn't know, she continued, as if my mother only deserved kindness after you learned she had saved your life. What if she hadn't? Would it be all right that you shouted at her? That you made her beg for a job she earned over 10 years? Martha placed a hand over Annie's wrist, but this time she did not ask her to stop. Richard sat without speaking. The lines around his mouth seemed deeper than they had at lunchtime. Finally, he looked at Martha. I don't know how to answer that without making myself sound worse. Then perhaps do not answer yet, Martha said. Perhaps sit with it until you understand why my daughter is asking. Outside, the first drops of rain began tapping against the front window. Richard heard them. His face changed. For a brief moment, he was no longer a man seated in his own restaurant. He was on the ground again, unable to draw breath, while a woman he had never properly thanked knelt in the rain and told him he was not going to die alone. Martha rose from the table. I have had a long day, she said. Annie and I are going home. Richard stood quickly. Mrs. Carter, please. I need to say. Not tonight, she replied. Tonight, you need to remember. Annie took her mother's arm, and together they walked toward the door. Eleanor did not try to stop them. As Martha stepped outside, Annie opened the old brown umbrella from her mother's bag and held it over both of them. Behind the window, Richard remained standing beside the table, watching the rain fall against the glass as though it had finally come back to collect a debt he had forgotten he owed. The rain followed Annie and Martha all the way home, running in silver lines across the windshield of Martha's old Ford. Usually, after a late shift, Martha would ask whether Annie had eaten, whether she had finished the online application for community college, whether the car was making that clicking sound again. That evening, she drove with both hands on the wheel and said nothing. Annie lasted until they reached a red light on King Drive. You're not going back tomorrow, are you? Martha kept her eyes on the traffic signal. My name is still on the schedule. Mama, he fired you. Then he took it back because his wife reminded him you saved his life. He owns the restaurant. That doesn't answer me. The light changed. Martha drove another block before pulling into the narrow space behind their apartment building. She switched off the engine, but neither of them reached for the doors. I need my job, Annie. The simple words hurt more than any speech could have. We'll figure something out. With what? Martha asked, not sharply, only tiredly. Your internship check? The $40 in my checking account after the electric bill clears? Pride does not pay rent, baby. Annie turned toward the rain-dark window. She hated that her mother was right. She hated more that Richard Whitmore had known women like Martha needed work badly enough to absorb almost anything. Martha reached across the console and covered Annie's hand. What happened today was wrong, she said. Do not mistake my going back for saying otherwise. But I have spent too many years keeping us steady to let one man's temper knock everything out from under us. Annie nodded, though she did not trust herself to speak. The next morning, the Sterling room looked exactly as it had before. White tablecloths were pressed flat. Water glasses caught the early light. A delivery man wheeled crates of vegetables toward the kitchen as if the dining room had not witnessed Martha Carter's humiliation the day before. Inside the employee entrance, conversation stopped when Martha walked in. Louise, the prep cook, was the first to approach her. Miss Carter, you shouldn't have to be here. Martha hung her coat in her locker. Neither should you. Not with that cough. but here we both are." He attempted a smile, then lowered his voice. "Everyone knows what happened. We're with you." Martha tied on her apron. "Then be with me by getting those onions cut before 11. A few people laughed softly, relieved to be given something ordinary to do. Annie understood what her mother was doing. She was taking the room back one task at a time. By 10:30, the kitchen was moving. Martha checked the soup, corrected a sauce, showed a young line cook how to trim the fat from short ribs without wasting good meat. She spoke evenly and kept her eyes on her work. Only Annie noticed that whenever the door to the dining room opened, her mother's shoulders tightened. At 11, the general manager, Mr. Lewis, appeared by the pass. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "Mr. Whitmore would like to speak with you in his office." Martha did not look up from the pan in front of her. "I'm preparing lunch service." He said it would only take a moment. Annie set down the stack of menus she had been carrying. "I'm coming with her." Mr. Lewis looked uncomfortable. "He requested your mother." "She can decide who stands beside her," Annie said. Martha removed her gloves, wiped her hands on a towel, and looked at Annie. "Come on then." Richard's office was on the second floor, above the dining room. Annie had never been inside it. The walls held framed newspaper covers praising his hotels and photographs of him shaking hands with mayors, chefs, athletes, men in expensive suits. Eleanor stood near the window. Richard was behind his desk, but when Martha and Annie entered, he came around it rather than asking them to sit across from him. "Mrs. Carter," he began. "Annie, thank you for coming." Martha remained standing. "I have a kitchen downstairs." "Yes, of course." He cleared his throat. "I wanted to apologize for yesterday." Annie waited. She could tell from his expression that he expected something to happen after those words, some small easing of the room. Martha said, "Go on." Richard glanced at Eleanor, then back at her. "I was under pressure. The meeting before lunch had gone badly, and I allowed my frustration to fall on you. It was unacceptable." Annie heard the careful language. "Under pressure, allowed my frustration, unacceptable." Words polished until they no longer touched the wound. Martha heard it too. "You shouted at me," she said. "You told me I was too slow to work in your kitchen. You ordered me out while my daughter and my coworkers watched. Then, when I asked you not to take my job, you told security to remove both of us." Richard's face reddened. "I know what I said." "Do you?" He could not answer. Martha continued, "Because what hurt my daughter was not only that you spoke to me that way, it was that I asked to stay." She watched her mother plead for work in front of a man who had already decided she was beneath him. "Mama," Annie whispered. Martha's eyes stayed on Richard. "I have been thinking about that all night. I should never have had to ask you for the dignity I had earned long before yesterday." Eleanor pressed her lips together, holding back tears. Richard looked down. "You are right. That does not make it repaired." "No," he said, "it doesn't." For the first time, his apology sounded less like a statement prepared for a difficult meeting, and more like a man admitting he had no defense. Richard opened a folder on his desk. "I have arranged paid leave for you for as long as you need, full wages. Your position will be protected." Martha's expression cooled. "I did not come here for leave. I thought it might help. What would help is knowing you will never speak to another employee the way you spoke to me, whether they once saved your life or whether they simply came to work and did their best." Richard looked at her for several seconds. "I will not." Annie wanted to believe him. She could not yet. Martha reached for the office door. "Then let me return to my kitchen." As she turned, Richard said, "Mrs. Carter, I am grateful for what you did that night." Martha stopped but did not face him. "You should be," she said. "But gratitude after cruelty is a poor substitute for character." She walked out with Annie beside her. Behind them, Eleanor turned to her husband. "She gave you your life once," she said quietly. "Yesterday, you showed her what kind of man you made of it." Downstairs, Martha returned to the stove. Annie watched her lift the lid from the soup pot, breathe in the steam, and reach for the seasoning. The lunch crowd would arrive soon. People would sit down hungry and expect to be fed. For Martha Carter, the work had never been about Richard Whitmore. That was the truth he was only beginning to understand. Richard did not return to the dining room after Martha left his office. He stood at the window overlooking Wabash Avenue, watching cars turn through the damp intersection below while Eleanor remained near the bookshelf behind him. Downstairs, service had begun. He could hear only fragments of it through the floor, muted movement, a cart rolling across tile, the orderly work of people who had no choice but to continue with their day. "She went back to the kitchen," he said at last. "Of course she did. I offered her paid leave." Eleanor did not answer immediately. "You offered her a way to disappear while you decided what to do with your discomfort." Richard turned. "That is not fair." "No?" She looked at him without raising her voice. "You humiliated her yesterday, apologized this morning, and expected a practical arrangement to settle what you did. Martha does not want to be hidden away until people stop talking about it. I wasn't trying to hide her. You were trying to fix the part you understand. Payroll, position, liability." Eleanor picked up her purse from the chair. "This is not a damaged chair in one of your hotel suites, Richard. You cannot replace it and call the matter handled." He glanced toward the office door. "What do you want me to do?" "That question is part of the problem. You are still waiting for someone else to tell you how to be decent." She left before he could respond. Richard remained alone, surrounded by evidence of the life he had spent 30 years constructing. On the wall hung a photograph from the opening of his first hotel. He was younger then, standing with his mother beneath a banner, his smile too wide for the borrowed tuxedo he had worn. His mother had died 9 years ago. She had spent most of her life cleaning rooms in hotels owned by men who never learned her name. He sat down slowly. For the first time, Martha's face and his mother's face seemed to occupy the same space in his mind, not because they looked alike, but because he remembered the way his mother used to come home at night, feet swollen inside cheap shoes, and say she was fine because there was no money in being anything else. A knock sounded at the door. Mr. Lewis entered carefully. "Sir, I thought you should know there are reporters outside." Richard looked up. "Reporters?" "Someone posted a video from yesterday. It has been shared quite a bit this morning." He hesitated. "They are asking whether Mrs. Carter was fired." Richard leaned back. For a brief, ugly second, his first thought was the company, the restaurant brand, the hotels, the board, the headlines. His public relations team would have to contain. Then he heard Annie's voice again. "She deserved respect before she was useful to you." "Was she?" Mr. Lewis asked. "No." "Should I issue a statement?" Richard looked through the open door toward the staircase leading down to the restaurant. "Not until I speak to Mrs. Carter. She is on the lunch line." "I know." Downstairs, Annie was carrying 2 bowls of soup to an older couple near the window when the first television truck pulled up outside. She recognized the station logo and felt her stomach drop. 2 guests turned in their chairs to look through the glass. Another checked his phone, then held it out to the woman across from him. At the kitchen pass, Martha kept plating chicken as if the change in the dining room had nothing to do with her. "Mom," Annie said, stepping inside. "The news is here." Martha slid a plate forward. "Table 9 needs this while it is hot." "Did you hear me?" "Yes. A video is online. People know what he did." Martha reached for a spoon and tasted the gravy. "Then they know." Annie looked at her in disbelief. "Aren't you worried?" "I am worried that table 9 has been waiting 12 minutes. "Mama." Martha set down the spoon. "What do you want me to do, Annie? Walk outside and cry for a camera? Tell strangers the worst part of yesterday was not his voice, but the sound of my own voice asking him to let me keep working?" Annie fell quiet. Martha turned back to the stove, but her hand paused above the burner. "I know you want to protect me. I love you for it. But I will not let that man's behavior turn me into someone the world comes to stare at." Louise appeared at the pass. "Miss Carter, there's a woman asking for you out front. Says she's from Channel 7. Tell her I'm cooking." Annie watched him go, then stepped closer to her mother. "You don't have to say anything today. But you also don't have to pretend it didn't hurt." Martha's mouth tightened. She reached for the edge of the counter. "It hurt," she said at last. "Now hand me the parsley." Annie did, blinking back tears. 10 minutes later, Richard came through the kitchen doors. No one announced him. He removed his suit jacket before entering and held it over one arm, as if he understood that the kitchen belonged to different rules than his office. The cook slowed. Martha did not. "Mrs. Carter," he said. She arranged 2 slices of cornbread beside a plate of greens. "Lunch service is not over." "I know. I won't take much of your time." She handed the plate to Luis. Then speak. Richard glanced at the staff around them. The video of yesterday has reached the news. Reporters are outside. My office would like to release a statement. Annie moved closer to her mother. Martha wiped her hands on a towel. What kind of statement? The truth, Richard said. That I spoke to you in a way no employee should ever be spoken to. That you were not dismissed. That the delay in my meal was because you refused to serve food that did not meet your standards. Martha studied him. And will it say you only began to regret it after your wife reminded you I once saved your life? Richard's silence answered before he did. Yes, he said quietly. If you want it to, what I want should not be what makes you tell the truth. No, he said. It should not. The kitchen seemed to hold still around them. Richard continued. I cannot undo yesterday. I understand that now. But I will not allow anyone to suggest you failed at your job to protect my name. Martha looked toward Annie, whose face still carried doubt, then back at Richard. You may tell the truth, she said. All of it. But you do not use my name to make yourself look redeemed. Richard nodded. I understand. No, Martha replied, returning to the stove. You are beginning to. Richard accepted the words without protest. As he turned to leave, he saw an untouched tray of employee meals near the back counter. Chicken, greens, and a square of cornbread wrapped for someone working late. The smell stopped him. For an instant, rain returned to his memory, along with a woman's hand pressing an inhaler into his palm and a voice telling him to breathe. He placed his jacket back over his arm and walked out through the dining room toward the reporters waiting outside. For once, he had no assistant prepare the words for him. The reporters gathered around Richard before he had reached the front steps. Microphones rose toward him, questions overlapping in the cold afternoon air. Mr. Whitmore, did you fire the chef in the video? Did you know she was the woman who saved your life? Are you only apologizing because the incident was recorded? Richard had spent most of his adult life learning how to manage public attention. He knew when to smile, when to offer a measured answer, when to let an attorney step between him and an uncomfortable question. This time, he remained on the sidewalk alone. The woman in that video is Martha Carter, he said. She has worked at the Sterling Room for 10 years. Yesterday, after a delay in my lunch order, I spoke to her in a cruel and unacceptable way. The questions quieted. She was not careless. She delayed my meal because she refused to serve food that was improperly prepared. She was doing her job. I was the one who failed to conduct myself with any decency. A reporter near the front called out, "Is it true she saved your life last year?" Richard looked through the restaurant window. Beyond the tables, through the kitchen door's round glass, he could see movement but not Martha herself. Yes, he said. That is true. During a severe asthma attack, Mrs. Carter found me, helped me use my inhaler, called an ambulance, and stayed with me until I reached the hospital. Did you know who she was when you shouted at her? No. Would you be standing here apologizing if you had never found out? The question landed harder than the others. Richard did not turn away from it. I don't know, he admitted, and that is the part I will have to live with. Mrs. Carter should not have needed to save my life to deserve my respect. Inside the restaurant, Annie watched from behind the hostess station. A few customers had turned in their seats toward the windows. Luis had come out from the kitchen carrying a bus tub and stopped when he heard Richard's last sentence. Martha remained at the stove. He said the right thing, Luis whispered. Annie folded a napkin that did not need folding. Saying it in front of cameras is easy when everyone is already angry with you. Luis gave her a careful look. Maybe. Still better than hiding. Annie did not answer. She had spent the previous night hearing her mother's voice over and over. The voice that had gone smaller, as she begged Richard not to take away her job. No public statement could make Annie forget that. When the lunch shift ended, the reporters were still outside, though the crowd had thinned. Mr. Lewis told the staff they could use the rear entrance if they preferred not to be questioned. Martha thanked him, changed out of her chef's coat and reached for the brown coat she had worn in the rain the evening before. Annie noticed it at once. Are we going out the back? Martha buttoned the coat. I'm going through the front. I did not do anything shameful. Before they could leave the locker area, Eleanor appeared at the doorway. She was alone. Mrs. Carter, Annie, she said. Richard would like to speak with you before you go. Only if you are willing. Annie's hand closed around the strap of her bag. He already spoke to the news. Eleanor nodded. He did. So now he wants us to tell him he's forgiven? No. Eleanor's gaze settled on Martha. I believe he wants to say what he should have said without expecting anything in return. Martha stood in silence for a moment. Then she said, 5 minutes. Richard was waiting in the dining room, not in his office. He had chosen a small table near the kitchen door. No private room. No desk between them. The table had been cleared except for 4 glasses of water no one touched. When Martha and Annie approached, he stood. I appreciate you agreeing to hear me, he said. Martha remained beside the chair. Speak, Mr. Whitmore. Richard nodded. His usual confidence was absent now, and Annie wondered whether he knew how different he looked without it. I apologized publicly because the public heard what I said to you, he began. But that statement was not an apology to you. It was only the truth I owed everyone who saw what happened. Martha listened without expression. He went on, I spent this afternoon trying to understand why I behaved the way I did. I could say the meeting went badly. I could say I was tired or angry or embarrassed. All of that is true, and none of it matters. I saw someone I believed had less power than I did, and I thought I could unload my anger onto her without consequence. Annie looked at him more closely. That was the first thing he had said that did not sound rehearsed. Richard turned to Martha. I cannot ask you to forget what I said. I cannot ask you to believe I have changed, because I have been ashamed for one afternoon. But I am sorry. Not because you rescued me, because you were standing in front of me as a human being, and I treated you as though you were not. Martha lowered her eyes briefly. Annie knew the motion. Her mother was steadying herself, not softening. Richard continued, I also owe your daughter an apology. Annie, you should never have had to protect your mother from me. You should never have had to beg my wife to keep your mother employed. I put you in that position. Annie felt her face grow warm. She had not expected him to mention that part. Still, she said, apologizing doesn't give her back that moment. No, he replied, it does not. And it doesn't change the fact that if Mrs. Whitmore hadn't recognized her, you would have thrown us out. His voice lowered. I know. No, you know now, Annie said. My mother knew it while she was standing there. Martha reached gently for Annie's hand. That is enough, baby. It isn't enough, Annie said, her eyes filling. He gets to say he's sorry, and everyone gets to feel better because the rich man admitted he was wrong. But you still had to stand there and ask him not to take away the job you earned. Richard absorbed each word without interrupting. Martha squeezed Annie's hand, then looked at him. My daughter is angry because she loves me. Do not ask her to surrender that anger simply because it is uncomfortable for you. I won't. Good. Martha lifted her purse from the back of the chair. Then, understand this. I hear your apology. I am not ready to accept it. Richard's shoulders lowered slightly, as though the answer hurt and relieved him at the same time. I understand. Martha shook her head. You will understand when what happened here changes how you treat the next person who cannot do anything for you. That is where an apology lives, Mr. Whitmore. Not in words, in what follows them. She turned toward the front entrance. Annie followed, still holding her mother's hand. At the door, Annie looked back once. Richard had not sat down. He remained beside the table, alone beneath the dining room lights, watching Martha leave through the front entrance in the same brown coat she had worn on the night she saved his life. Outside, reporters called her name. But Martha did not stop. She opened her umbrella, placed one arm around Annie's shoulders, and walked into the rain. Inside, Richard lowered his head. He had offered an apology and received no forgiveness. For the first time in his life, he understood that the absence of forgiveness was not an injustice. It was a consequence. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the sidewalks dark and the city washed clean in a way that felt undeserved to Richard. He had not slept. He had gone home, loosened his tie, sat at the edge of his bed, and listened while Eleanor moved quietly through the house without trying to comfort him. At 2 a.m, he walked into the kitchen and found her making tea. She was right, he said. Eleanor placed a second mug on the counter. About what? About me not understanding yet. He sat down. I kept thinking I needed the right words, as though one decent speech could erase what I said to her. It cannot. I know. Eleanor studied him over the rim of her cup. What will you do now? Richard looked at the table between them. What she asked. I will behave differently when no one is applauding me for it. That is a beginning, Eleanor said, not a conclusion. By 7, Richard was in his office at the Sterling Room. Before the doors opened, he called Mr. Lewis and asked him to assemble the morning staff in the dining room. Is something wrong, sir? The manager asked. Yes, Richard said. Something was wrong yesterday. I intend to address it. When Annie and Martha arrived through the employee entrance, the kitchen was unusually quiet. Louise was not chopping onions. The pastry cook was standing with her coat still on. Mr. Lewis appeared beside the lockers. Mrs. Carter, Mr. Whitmore has asked everyone to gather in the dining room before service. Martha closed her locker slowly. Did he say why? No, ma'am. Annie's stomach tightened. You don't have to go out there. Martha touched the folded apron in her hands. If it concerns the people I work with, I will hear it with them. The staff stood among the empty tables, servers in black vests, kitchen workers in clean whites, dishwashers, bartenders, and 2 hosts who usually never arrived until later. Some looked curious. Others watched Richard with caution. Word had traveled beyond the video. Everyone knew Martha had not accepted his apology. Eleanor stood near the bar, her coat still buttoned. She gave Martha a small nod but did not come closer. Richard waited until the room was quiet. I have asked you here because yesterday I disgraced this restaurant, he began. His voice was level, without the practiced assurance Annie had heard in his statement to reporters. Not Mrs. Carter, not her daughter. I did. Martha remained beside Annie, her face unreadable. Richard looked around at his employees. I have spent years insisting that this company represents excellence. Yet yesterday, when a meal was delayed because a chef cared enough to prepare it correctly, I responded with arrogance and cruelty. I embarrassed a woman who has given this restaurant 10 years of skilled work. I threatened her livelihood. And when her daughter defended her, I threatened hers as well. A server in the back lowered her eyes. Louis crossed his arms over his chest. Richard continued, Some of you saw it and could not stop me because I was your employer. I put you in that position too. No person should fear losing a job for objecting when someone is being degraded, including when the person causing that harm is me. Annie glanced at Martha. Her mother's grip on her apron had tightened. Mr. Lewis spoke quietly. Mr. Whitmore, perhaps we should prepare for opening. Richard held up one hand. In a moment, he stepped away from the table where he had been standing and walked toward Martha. Annie instinctively moved half a step forward. Martha gently caught her arm. Richard stopped several feet from them. Mrs. Carter, yesterday I asked you for a forgiveness I had not earned. You told me an apology lives in what follows it. I heard you. I will issue written employment protections today, so that no member of this staff can be dismissed in anger by me or any executive without review. I will also arrange for an independent employee advocate, outside my company, whom staff can contact without fear of retaliation. Martha looked at him closely. Those protections should have existed before I needed them. Yes, Richard said, they should have. That will help people who work here. It will not repair what you did to me. I know. He took another step toward her, then stopped again. His breath caught in his throat. Annie could see the effort it took for him not to retreat into his usual posture, the straight shoulders and clipped words of a man who had built a life around never appearing weak. Richard looked at Martha in front of everyone he employed. Then he lowered himself to his knees. Several people gasped. Eleanor covered her mouth, though she did not look surprised. Annie felt her own breath leave her. Martha stared at him. Mr. Whitmore, get up. No, he said, his voice unsteady. Not until I have said this without hiding behind an office door or a camera statement. The room was silent enough to hear the hum of the refrigerators beyond the kitchen doors. You found me on the ground when I could not breathe, Richard said. You could have walked past me. You could have called for help and gone home. Instead, you stayed. You treated my life as valuable before you knew my name, before you knew what I owned, before I could ever do anything for you. His eyes reddened, but he did not look away. Yesterday, I had every advantage. I had my health, my authority, and my voice. I used all of them to make you feel small. I ordered you out of a place. Your work helped make worthy of my name. I made your daughter beg for your job when I should have been thanking you for the dignity you brought to it. Annie covered her mouth with one hand. Martha stood rigidly, but tears had begun to gather in her eyes. Richard lowered his head. I cannot ask you to forget that. I cannot tell you I deserve another chance because I do not know that I do. But I am asking you, Martha Carter, to forgive me someday. If you ever find that you can, I am sorry for the man I was to you. Martha let the silence remain. No one shifted. No one rushed her. At last, she stepped forward. Look at me, she said. Richard lifted his face. My mother taught me that a man is not measured by how low he bows when he is ashamed. He is measured by how straight he stands the next time he has power over someone who cannot fight back. Richard nodded once, tears slipping down his cheeks. Stand up, Martha said. You are making a promise from down there. Keep it on your feet. Eleanor wiped her eyes. Annie pressed herself against her mother's shoulder as Richard slowly rose. Martha did not embrace him. She did not tell him everything was all right. Instead, she unfolded her apron and tied it around her waist. We open in 20 minutes, she said. If this restaurant is going to be better than it was yesterday, everyone has work to do. A small sound moved through the staff, part relief and part respect. Louise headed toward the kitchen first. The others followed. Richard remained where he was as Martha began to walk away. She paused at the kitchen door and looked back at him. I have heard your apology, she said. That is where we begin. Then she went back to work, and Annie followed her into the kitchen, where the ovens were warming, and the first meal of a different day was waiting to be made. By the end of the evening shift, the story had traveled farther than anyone inside the Sterling room could control. Customers came in pretending not to know what had happened, then looked toward the kitchen every time Martha crossed the dining room. A few asked for her by name. One older woman pressed Martha's hand between both of hers and said, My husband and I have eaten here for 8 years. We came tonight because we wanted you to know we see you. Martha thanked her, returned to the kitchen, and finished plating dinner as though gratitude, like humiliation, could not be allowed to interrupt the work. Annie watched her mother closely. Martha smiled at the staff. She corrected a soup that needed salt. She laughed when Louise dropped a spoon and blamed the floor for moving, but when she thought no one was looking, she flexed her fingers at the sink and let her shoulders sag for a moment. On the drive home, Annie finally said, He meant what he said today. Martha kept her eyes on the street. I believe he meant it while he was saying it. That isn't the same thing? No, baby. Meaning something in a painful moment is one thing. Living by it once the pain has passed is another. Annie leaned against the passenger window. Storefront lights passed over her face, then disappeared. Do you think you'll forgive him? Martha was quiet long enough that Annie assumed she would not answer. I think forgiveness is often misunderstood, she said at last. People treat it like opening a door and pretending no one ever broke it down. I can refuse to carry hatred without trusting him yet, so he still has to prove himself. We all do, sooner or later. At home, Martha heated leftover soup, though neither of them ate much. Annie went to her room with her laptop and tried to complete a training assignment for her internship, but the words on the screen would not settle into meaning. She kept seeing Richard on his knees, hearing the break in his voice. She wanted to resent him cleanly. It would have been easier if he had remained cruel. Across the city, Richard sat alone in the library of his Lakeshore Drive home. He had removed his tie and jacket, but his shirt was still buttoned at the collar, as though he had forgotten he was no longer in public. On the table before him lay a printed copy of the statement he had given to the press and the employment protections he had ordered his legal department to prepare. The pages looked small beside what they were supposed to repair. Eleanor entered carrying 2 mugs of chamomile tea. She placed one near his hand and sat in the armchair opposite him. You haven't eaten, she said. I wasn't hungry. You should try. Richard looked toward the dark window. The reflection staring back at him seemed older than it had 2 days earlier. I keep hearing her daughter, he said. She said Martha deserved respect before I knew she had helped me. She was right. I know she was right. He rubbed his forehead. What I cannot understand is how I became the man who needed to be told. Eleanor lifted her mug but did not drink. You spent years surrounding yourself with people who depend on your approval. After a while, no one tells you when your impatience becomes cruelty. They learn how to avoid it instead. My mother would have been ashamed of me. Yes, Eleanor said. He looked at her, surprised by the answer. She held his gaze. You do not need me to make that gentler. Your mother cleaned hotel rooms for years. She raised you to greet every person in a building. not only the ones wearing suits. You know what she would have thought. Richard looked down at his hands. He remembered being 12 years old, waiting at the end of a hallway while his mother finished changing bedsheets in rooms where guests left towels on the floor and coins on the nightstand, as if a few quarters were an apology. She used to tell him that honest work was never small, only small-minded people made others feel that way. Somewhere between those hallways and the dining room bearing his company's name, he had stopped listening. "I gave Martha paid leave," he said. "New protections. An apology. None of it felt like enough. Because none of it was for her dream," Eleanor replied. "It was only protection from your failure." Richard frowned slightly. Eleanor set down her tea. "Do you know anything about her besides what she did for you?" He thought about it. "She has worked at the restaurant for 10 years. She is a chef. Annie is her daughter. That is her employment file, not her life." Richard did not answer. Eleanor continued. "I spoke with Mr. Lewis this afternoon. Martha designed 3 of the most popular comfort dishes on the winter menu: the braised short ribs, the cornbread dressing, and the peach bread pudding. Her name never appeared beside any of them because she was told customers came for the Whitmore name." Richard looked up sharply. "Who told her that? Does it matter whether it came directly from you? It happened in a business you created." The sentence stayed with him. He rose and walked to a cabinet where old company binders were stored. He pulled out menu reports from the Sterling room, flipping through them until he found the dishes Eleanor had named. Each had strong sales figures. Each had been credited to the restaurant's executive culinary team. There was no mention of Martha Carter. "What did she want?" he asked. Eleanor gave him a sad look. "Why do you assume anyone asked her?" Richard closed the binder. He remembered Martha at the stove after he apologized, returning to a kitchen where her talent had made money for him while her own name remained invisible. He thought of the coat she had worn in the rain, the job she had begged to keep, Annie's voice breaking as she offered to leave in her mother's place. "Annie said her mother earned that job," he murmured. "Perhaps I have been asking her to settle for far less than she earned." Eleanor watched him carefully. "What are you thinking?" Richard walked back to the table, picked up his phone, then stopped. For once, he did not want to begin by summoning lawyers or accountants. Not until he knew what he was offering and why. "I am thinking Martha Carter has spent 10 years making a restaurant with my name on the door worth visiting," he said. "And I am thinking it is time she had a kitchen with her own name on it." Eleanor did not smile, but the tension in her expression eased. "Do not present it as a gift," she said. "She will never take it." "No." Richard looked at the untouched tea in front of him. "It will not be a gift. It will be ownership. Her recipes, her decisions, her name. And if she refuses, then she refuses." He drew in a breath. "But I will still make sure she knows she deserved more long before I finally noticed." The clock on the mantel read nearly midnight when Richard opened a blank legal pad and wrote Martha Carter's name across the top. For the first time in years, a business decision did not begin with what he might gain. It began with what another person had already earned. The following morning, Martha found Richard Whitmore waiting outside the employee entrance before she had taken her coat off. He was not wearing one of the dark suits Annie had come to associate with him. He had on a plain gray overcoat, his hands tucked into the pockets as if he had not known what to do with them while he waited. Eleanor stood beside him holding a slim leather folder. Annie slowed the moment she saw them. "Mama, you don't have to talk to him before your shift." Martha looked at Richard. "Is someone sick?" The question unsettled him. "No." "Then I have prep work." "I know. I wouldn't be here unless I thought it mattered." Martha glanced at the employee door. Steam had already begun to gather on the kitchen window, and through it she could see Louise setting out cutting boards. 5 minutes, she said. "In the dining room, not your office." Richard nodded. Of course. They sat at a table near the window, the same one where he had apologized 2 days earlier. Morning light lay across the white cloth, exposing each crease. Annie sat beside her mother, without asking permission. Eleanor took the chair next to Richard, though the folder remained unopened in her lap. Richard began carefully. "Last night, Eleanor told me that several of the dishes most associated with this restaurant came from you." Martha's expression did not change. "I contributed recipes. You did more than contribute. The sales reports show that your short ribs and peach bread pudding have carried our winter menu for years. They carried customers through cold evenings, Martha said. I never cooked them for a report. No, I suppose that is part of why they matter. Annie watched him, unsure where this was leading. Her mother must have felt the same because she placed both hands flat on the table and said, Mr. Whitmore, if this is another apology, I heard the first one. It is not another apology. He looked down for a moment. Though I will owe you that apology for a long time. Eleanor opened the folder and passed it across the table. Martha did not touch it. Richard said, I own a property on South Cottage Grove. It was a cafe several years ago. It has been closed since the lease ended. But the structure is sound. There is a working kitchen, street parking, enough dining space for about 40 guests, and a small room in back that could be used for private dinners or community meals. Martha's eyes narrowed. Why are you telling me this? Because I would like to renovate it and transfer ownership to you. Annie looked from Richard to her mother. Martha was still, so still that Annie knew the words had reached her before she had decided how to respond. Richard continued, Not management. Not a promotion under my company. Ownership. The restaurant would be yours. You would choose the name, the menu, the staff, the hours. There would be no Whitmore brand on the door unless you wanted it, and I cannot imagine why you would. Martha pushed the folder back without opening it. No, Richard had expected resistance, but perhaps not the speed of it. Mrs. Carter. I said no. Annie turned toward her. Mama, maybe you should at least look at it. Martha's voice remained controlled. I know what it is. Eleanor leaned forward. Martha, this is not meant to insult you. Then tell me what it is meant to be. Martha looked at Richard. 2 days ago, I was good enough to cook in your kitchen but not important enough to speak to with respect. Now everyone has seen what you did, and suddenly I deserve a building? Richard accepted the blow without moving. You deserved it before I knew enough to offer it. That does not answer my question. He drew a breath. It is meant to be recognition, late recognition, and I understand how badly that sounds. You have spent 10 years creating food my business profited from while someone else's name stood over the door. I cannot change those years. I can stop allowing that arrangement to continue. Martha looked away toward the empty restaurant. Annie saw something pass across her face, not temptation exactly, but the pain of hearing aloud what she had taught herself not to want. I do not need charity, Martha said. No, Richard replied. You do not. I do not need a rich man handing me a kitchen because he feels ashamed when he sees my face. That is not what I want to do. It may not be what you want to call it. Richard lowered his eyes. Eleanor did not rescue him. Annie touched her mother's arm. He's saying the restaurant would be yours. Martha turned to her daughter. And every morning I opened that door, I would have to wonder whether I earned it or whether someone's guilty conscience bought it for me. You earned it, Annie said before Richard could answer. You earned it before any of this happened. The words seemed to take some of the strength out of Martha's anger. She looked at Annie for a long moment, then back at Richard. Richard spoke quietly. Your daughter is right, but I understand why my saying so is not enough. Martha stood. Then understand that my answer is no. Richard rose too, but he did not reach for the folder. May I ask one thing? She waited. If this offer had come from someone else, someone who had never humiliated you, would you have wanted that kitchen? Martha's mouth tightened. For a second, Annie thought she would leave without answering. Yes, she said. I would have wanted it all my life. Then she walked through the kitchen doors, leaving the folder untouched on the table. Annie stayed behind for one breath longer. She isn't trying to punish you, she told Richard. She just spent too many years having to be grateful for less than she deserved. I know, he said. Annie shook her head. No. You're beginning to. She followed her mother into the kitchen. Richard remained standing beside the unopened folder. Eleanor placed her hand over it, keeping him from picking it up too quickly. Do not chase her with papers, she said. I heard her say no. You also heard her say she wanted it. Richard looked toward the kitchen door, where the first sounds of Martha's morning work had already begun. Yes, he said, and if I offer it again, it must be in a way that does not ask her to carry my shame along with her dream. For the next 3 days, Richard did not speak to Martha about the building again. He came to the Sterling room only once, for a meeting upstairs, and when he passed through the dining room, he greeted the hostess, thanked the busboy who held the door, and disappeared without asking to see the kitchen. Annie noticed. Martha noticed too, though she said nothing. On Thursday afternoon, after the lunch rush, Chef Odessa Green came through the front door wearing a wool hat and carrying a tin of lemon cookies. She had taught Martha years earlier in a neighborhood cooking program and still carried herself like the owner of any kitchen she entered. Martha came out from behind the swinging doors with surprise in her face. "Odessa, what are you doing here? Visiting an old friend who forgot she has a telephone." Odessa handed her the tin, then looked toward Annie. "And checking whether this girl has learned to stop overworking her mother." Annie smiled despite herself. "I'm still trying." Martha led Odessa to a table near the back. They had barely sat down when Eleanor entered. Martha's smile faded. "You arranged this?" she asked. Eleanor stopped a respectful distance away. "I asked Odessa to come because I thought you deserved advice from someone you trust, not pressure from us." Odessa reached across the table and patted Martha's wrist. "Before you get mad at me, hear the woman out. I told her I wouldn't sell you a dream that came with strings tied around your neck." Richard came in behind Eleanor carrying no folder this time. He did not sit until Martha gave a small nod. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "Not another attempt to persuade you before you are ready." Martha folded her arms. "Go ahead. The restaurant property is owned by a holding company I control. I have instructed my attorneys to prepare an unconditional transfer of ownership to you. There will be no repayment, no percentage owed to me, no branding requirement, and no provision allowing me to take it back. Before anything is signed, you may choose your own attorney to review every page. I will pay that attorney's fee, but the attorney will answer to you." Martha watched him without blinking. "And why should I accept a building from a man who treated me the way you did?" Richard looked down briefly, then met her eyes. "You should not accept it to ease my conscience. If that is all it would mean to you, refuse it. But this did not begin the day I shouted at you. It began years earlier, when you created dishes that helped build this restaurant's reputation and were never given ownership, credit, or opportunity. My behavior exposed what I had failed to see for a long time. You did not know my name until it embarrassed you not to," Martha said. "No," he replied. "I did not. I cannot make that less shameful by pretending otherwise." Odessa broke a cookie in half but did not eat it. "Martha, what would you do with a place of your own?" Martha looked at her sharply. "Do not join him." I asked a question. Martha exhaled. The dining room had emptied around them, leaving only the quiet clink of dishes being stacked near the service station. "I would cook food people recognize," she said after a while. "Not dressed up until it forgets where it came from. Braised short ribs on Sundays. Greens cooked slowly. Cornbread that does not crumble into dust before it reaches the plate. Peach cobbler in a real dish, not arranged like decoration." Annie's face softened. She had heard her mother talk about meals. She had never heard her talk about a restaurant as though she could see it. Martha continued despite herself. "I would keep one table available for older folks who come in alone. Some people do not need a reservation. They need somewhere they are expected." Odessa smiled. "That sounds less like charity and more like a business plan." Martha shook her head. "A business still has bills," Richard said, "and it should survive on its food, not on my guilt. I will fund the renovation and transfer the property before opening. After that, the restaurant's income and decisions are yours." Annie turned toward her mother. "Mama, you always told me never to confuse pride with dignity. Maybe dignity is being allowed to take what your work should have earned you years ago." Martha looked at her daughter, surprised by the words. "You have been listening after all," she said softly. "Every day." Martha was quiet for a long time. Then she looked at Richard. "If I even consider this, there are conditions." Richard sat straighter. "Name them." "The restaurant belongs to me. Fully. My name, my menu, my employees, my decisions. You do not walk in and change a chair without asking." "Agreed." Annie stays involved. She will learn the business properly, not just carry plates and watch other people make decisions. If she chooses college, culinary school, or management training, the schedule makes room for that. Richard glanced at Annie. "Agreed. And one evening every week, we serve people who need a meal whether they can pay full price or not. Seniors, families having a hard month, anyone who comes in hungry and has too much pride to say so aloud." Richard's answer came without hesitation. Agreed. Martha leaned back. You answered quickly, because none of those conditions are burdens. They are reasons the place should exist. For the first time since the day in the dining room, Martha looked at him without anger, pushing everything else aside. Eleanor reached into her purse and took out a business card. This is an attorney who has no connection to Richard's company. Odessa recommended her. Speak with her first. Sign nothing until she tells you it is truly yours. Martha accepted the card, turning it over between her fingers. I am not forgiving you because of a restaurant, she told Richard. I know, and I am not letting people say you gave me a life. No, he said. You built your life. I am returning a door that should have opened for you long ago. Martha looked at Annie. Her daughter was trying not to hope too openly and failing. At last, Martha placed the business card in her apron pocket. I will meet the attorney, she said. That is all I am promising today. Annie reached for her hand, unable to contain her smile. Richard stood, but he did not offer his hand or thank her as though she had done him a favor. He simply nodded. That is more than enough. 6 months later, Annie stood across the street from a brick storefront on South Cottage Grove, watching a new sign being lifted into place above the door. Martha stood beside her, one hand pressed over her mouth. The sign read, Martha's Grace. Beneath it, in smaller letters, were the words Martha had chosen herself. No one leaves hungry here. By 7 that morning, Martha's Grace already smelled like the kind of place people remembered before they had even eaten there. On the stove, collard greens simmered with smoked turkey and onions. 2 pans of cornbread cooled beside the window, their tops brushed with honey butter. In the back, peach cobblers waited beneath clean towels, the filling still warm enough to scent the whole kitchen. Annie stood on a short ladder beneath the front wall, trying to straighten a framed photograph of her mother. A little left, Martha called from the pass. Annie shifted it. No, your other left. Mama, you have given me 3 different lefts in the last minute. Chef Odessa, seated at the counter with a cup of coffee she had not paid for and had no intention of paying for, laughed into her napkin. Leave that girl alone. The picture is straight. You're nervous. Martha turned back to the pan in front of her. I am not nervous. I am making sure things are right. That is what nervous cooks always say. Annie climbed down and looked around the dining room. When the space had first been shown to them, it had been empty and tired, with faded paint and a kitchen that needed almost everything replaced. Now there were warm wood tables, cream-colored walls, and small vases with yellow flowers on every table. Near the entrance hung the sign Martha had insisted on making simple enough for anyone to understand. No one leaves hungry here. Below it sat a narrow bench for guests waiting on a table. Martha had placed it there after saying older people should never be expected to stand simply because a restaurant was busy. On the wall beside the kitchen door, Annie had arranged a few photographs. Martha in her first white chef's coat, Annie as a little girl holding a mixing bowl too large for her arms, Odessa at a neighborhood block party with an apron tied over a Sunday dress. There was no photograph of Richard Whitmore. Martha had never said there should not be one. Annie had never considered asking. At 10 minutes before 11, Martha adjusted the collar of Annie's pale blue blouse and stepped back. You look beautiful, Annie smiled. You look like you're about to tell an entire building what to do. I am. It is my building. The words came out quietly, but they stopped them both for a moment. Martha looked through the front window at the sign above the sidewalk. Martha's Grace. She had seen it every day for 2 weeks while they stocked shelves, hired staff, and tested recipes. Yet on opening morning, the name seemed to reach her differently. For years, she had entered kitchens through back doors and employee hallways. She had hung her coat in lockers beneath someone else's rules, cooked recipes that carried other people's names, and thanked managers for shifts she had earned through work. Now a key to her own front door rested in her apron pocket. Annie took her hand. You ready? Martha let out a slow breath. No. Odessa rose from the counter. Good. People who are too ready usually do not understand what matters. At 11, Annie unlocked the door. The first guests were Mr. and Mrs. Feldman from the Sterling room. Mr. Feldman carried a small pot of basil, while his wife held a card in both hands. We thought a new kitchen ought to have something green growing in it, Mrs. Feldman said. Martha accepted the plant carefully. You remembered. Mr. Feldman smiled. You remembered I cannot have onions for 8 years. We figured remembering basil was the least we could do. Behind them came Luis with his wife and 2 grown daughters. Then the older woman who had held Martha's hand after the video spread through Chicago. Then neighbors from the block, members of Odessa's church, former customers, 2 nurses from the hospital where Richard had been treated, and several employees from the Sterling room who had asked to spend their day off helping serve. By noon, every table was taken. Annie moved between the dining room and kitchen with a small notebook tucked into her apron pocket. She had helped write the seating plan, schedule the servers, and calculate how long each table might need during the opening rush. Still, no plan accounted for people pausing Martha to tell her they were proud of her. At table 6, a widower named Mr. Bell tasted the cornbread dressing and put down his fork. "Mrs. Carter," he said when Martha checked on him, "my wife used to make this every Thanksgiving. She has been gone 4 years. I did not think I would taste anything like it again." Martha placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Then you come back next Thursday, Mr. Bell. I'll have some ready." He nodded, blinking behind his glasses. Annie saw the exchange from across the room and understood why her mother had wanted one table left for people who came alone. Food could not return what a person had lost, but sometimes it let them sit beside the memory without being swallowed by it. Near 1 o'clock, a woman entered with 2 young sons and paused at the host stand after studying the prices on the menu. Annie recognized the look. It was the same look Martha once wore in grocery stores when Annie was young, calculating without wanting anyone to see. "Are you joining us for lunch?" Annie asked. The woman hesitated. "Maybe another day." Martha had come from the kitchen carrying a tray of biscuits. She understood immediately. "We have an opening celebration today," she said. 3 lunch plates are waiting for the right family to claim them. I believe that must be you." The woman's eyes lowered. "I couldn't accept." "You could," Martha said. "And someday, when you are able, you can do the same for someone else." One of the boys looked toward the biscuits. Martha smiled. "Besides, these need honest opinions." They took a table by the window. Annie brought them sweet tea and watched the younger child break open a biscuit with both hands, his face lifting when steam escaped from the center. Odessa leaned toward Annie from her counter seat. "Your mother has owned this place half a day, and she is already giving away the profit." Annie smiled. "She planned for it." "Of course she did." The afternoon carried on in the steady rhythm Martha had spent her life building toward. Plates returned nearly clean. Laughter gathered near the front windows. Someone began taking photographs under the sign. When the last cobbler serving was sold, Louis stepped into the dining room and announced it as if the Chicago Cubs had won another championship, earning applause from every table. For the first time all day, Martha stood still. Annie joined her at the kitchen doorway. "How does it feel?" Martha looked at the filled tables, the empty plates, the basil plant now sitting on the windowsill. "Like I should have made more cobbler." Annie laughed and laid her head briefly on her mother's shoulder. As evening approached, the front door opened again. Annie glanced toward it, wondering whether there was room for one more guest. But the man who had made this day possible was nowhere among the people walking in. Martha noticed her looking. "He does not need to be here today," she said. Annie nodded. "Do you think he'll ever come?" Martha turned toward the kitchen, where another batch of cornbread was ready to come out of the oven. "If he does," she said, "he will come through the same door as everyone else." By the end of Martha's Grace's first month, the restaurant had found its rhythm. Sunday afternoons belonged to families dressed for church, older couples who preferred the booth near the window, and neighbors who liked to argue about whether Martha's cornbread or peach cobbler was her finest achievement. Wednesday evenings belonged to the community table, when anyone who needed a warm meal could sit down without being asked for an explanation. Annie had grown comfortable at the host stand. She knew which tables needed room for a walker, which guests wanted coffee before the menu, and which children should be offered extra biscuits before they became restless. Martha had enrolled her in an evening hospitality management course at Kennedy King College, insisting that talent mattered, but knowing how to protect a business mattered too. One Sunday evening, as daylight faded over South Cottage Grove, Annie was closing out a receipt when the bell over the front door sounded. Richard Whitmore stood inside with Eleanor and their 2 adult children. He wore a dark wool coat, not the sharp suit Annie remembered from the Sterling room. There was no driver waiting at the curb, no assistant speaking ahead of him, no request for a private table. The 4 of them stood beneath the sign that read, "No one leaves hungry here," and waited. Annie's hand paused over the register. Richard gave a restrained nod. "Good evening, Annie." "Mr. Whitmore." Eleanor smiled carefully. "The place is beautiful." "Thank you." Richard glanced toward the dining room. Nearly every table was occupied. We did not make a reservation. That was my mistake. Annie could not help noticing how strange it sounded to hear him admit to an ordinary mistake without trying to make it someone else's problem. We have a wait tonight, she said. About 20 minutes. Richard nodded. Then we'll wait. His daughter, a woman near 30 with Eleanor's gentle expression, moved toward the bench. Dad, I told you we should have called. You did, Richard said. I should have listened. Annie looked toward the kitchen. Martha was placing short ribs onto a serving platter, but she had already noticed who had entered. Their eyes met across the room. Annie did not need to ask what to do. 4 guests waiting, Martha called to one of the servers. Offer them sweet tea while they sit. Richard heard her voice. He turned toward the kitchen door, but Martha had already returned to her work. They waited like everyone else. 2 older women leaving after dinner recognized Richard and whispered to each other as they passed him. A man near the front looked up from his plate and studied him for a moment. Richard did not shrink from the attention, nor did he try to control it. He held his glass of tea and sat beside his wife beneath the sign Martha had chosen. 22 minutes later, Annie approached. Your table is ready. Richard rose and followed her to table 4, near the front window. It was not hidden and not specially arranged. Annie placed menus in front of each of them. Our Sunday special is braised short ribs with greens, macaroni and cheese, and cornbread, she said. Peach cobbler if there's any left by dessert. Richard looked at the menu, then set it down. I'll have the special. Eleanor smiled. We all will. Annie wrote it down, though she already knew. I'll put it in. In the kitchen, Martha read the ticket once, then reached for 4 plates. She did not hand the order to Louise. She sliced the cornbread herself, spooned greens beside the ribs and wiped the edge of each plate before placing them on the tray. Annie watched her. Do you want me to take it? Martha shook her head. No, I'll do it. The conversation at table 4 stopped when Martha approached. Richard rose at once. Mrs. Carter, sit down, Mr. Whitmore. Food is meant to be eaten warm. He sat. Martha placed each plate in front of the family, serving Eleanor first, then their children, and Richard last. Richard looked at the meal before him for several seconds. I hoped I would have a chance to tell you this in person. Martha waited. I have passed this street 3 times since you opened, he said. Each time, I kept driving because I thought perhaps coming inside would ask something of you that I had no right to ask. And what brought you in tonight? My wife. A small smile touched his mouth. She said staying away forever could become another way of making everything about my feelings. Eleanor lifted her brows. He does listen occasionally. Martha's expression softened, though only slightly. Richard looked at her again. Thank you for allowing my family to eat here. I did not allow anything special, Martha said. You waited for a table. You ordered dinner. That is how restaurants work. Yes, he replied. I am learning there is comfort in being treated like everyone else. His son looked at him, perhaps unused to hearing his father speak that way. Eleanor placed her hand near Richard's on the table, not quite touching it. Richard picked up his fork, then put it back down. Mrs. Carter, I also want to thank you for the night in the parking lot. I know I said it before, but I said it while I was still mostly thinking about my shame. His voice remained low, meant for her rather than the room. I am alive because you chose not to walk past me. Martha studied him. Months earlier, she had seen a man burning with anger because his meal had been delayed. Now she saw someone sitting before a plate of food he had waited for, understanding that waiting had cost him nothing. You were in trouble, she said. I did what anyone should do. Richard lowered his eyes. I have learned not everyone does. For a moment, Martha said nothing. Then she drew a chair from the empty table beside them and sat at its edge. My grandmother used to say gratitude is not saying thank you until a person gets tired of hearing it, she said. It is what you do with the life you were given back. Richard nodded slowly. I remember that every day. Good. Martha stood. Then keep remembering. He looked up at her. Does that mean you forgive me? Annie, standing near the service station, held her breath. Martha considered him for a moment. It means I no longer need to keep the worst thing you did in the center of the room every time I see you. Richard's eyes shone. He did not press her for more. Thank you, he said. Martha gave him a look that stopped him from turning the moment into a ceremony. Eat your dinner, Mr. Whitmore. The cornbread is better hot. A soft laugh escaped Eleanor. Richard looked down at his plate and took his first bite. He closed his eyes briefly. Not from memory this time, but from the simple privilege of receiving something made with care. Later, when their plates were empty and only crumbs remained on the dessert dishes, Richard left a normal tip on the table and a folded note beneath the receipt. Annie found it while clearing dishes. It contained no check, no offer, and no grand promise. Only 4 handwritten words. "Thank you for the table." She brought it to Martha in the kitchen. Martha read it, folded it once, and tucked it into the pocket of her apron beside the key to her restaurant. Outside, Richard and Eleanor walked slowly toward their car, their children beside them. Inside, Martha's Grace remained full of conversation, coffee being poured and chairs drawing close around tables. Annie stood beside her mother at the kitchen door and looked at the room they had built from years of work, hurt, and love. "You okay?" she asked. Martha slipped one arm around her daughter. "I am," she said. "Now go check whether table 7 wants cobbler before Louise sells the last piece." Annie smiled and returned to the dining room. Above the entrance, the words remained where every guest could read them: "No one leaves hungry here." Some people came hungry for a meal. Some came hungry for dignity, for forgiveness, or for the chance to become better than the person they had been. At Martha's table, there was room for all of them. The story reminds us that wealth and power never give anyone the right to humiliate another person. Martha deserved respect long before Richard learned that she had once saved his life. True remorse is not shown through words alone, but through changed behavior, humility, and a willingness to restore the dignity of those we have hurt. Annie's courage also teaches us that standing up for someone we love can be the first step toward justice. In the end, kindness may be quiet, but it leaves a mark far greater than pride ever can. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.